typically the second Wednesday of every month, where we have presentations, project presentations, and invite a very broad audience to join us in the conversation. So welcome. I see a lot of new faces, so welcome to all of those that perhaps haven't been here before, and welcome back to those who have. If you didn't sign in, there are sign-in sheets. If you would please sign in, even if you've been here before. We do try to track who's coming and who's here so we can get a bit of a head count and know who we're attracting. And also, if you are new, this will get you on the mailing list for notifications for upcoming presentations, and as well as other opportunities and informational things from the Prevention Research Center for Healthy Neighborhoods. Okay, feel free to grab some food and settle in. I'm excited to have the opportunity to present to the next speaker. This is Dr. David Cavallo, who has joined the faculty just this July, and has joined us from UCLA. So we have ordered up a fairly mild winter compared to last winter. Compared to last winter, it really was about -14 this week. But Dr. Cavallo has an MPH and a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he is trained as a behavioral scientist and really has been focusing in on social media, mobile health, electronic health, different kinds of communication technologies, and applying those to behavioral health interventions, mostly around nutrition, physical activity, and obesity-related diseases. So I think he has some really interesting research to present today for us. Title of his talk is Behavior Change Interventions Using Social Media, User-Generated Approaches. I meant to say that David is in the Department of Nutrition, and I think we've got some folks from the Nutrition Department here. Yes? Give a shout out. There they are. So friends in the audience. I think everybody will be friendly. But our format will be that there'll be some presentation, and then a little bit of space for discussion and questions, so that we can tap into the rich perspectives of folks here in the audience. So without further ado.
Thank you, Sue. So I want to thank the PRC for inviting me here today, and I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm really excited that you're here, and excited that there's interest in this topic, which I'm really passionate about and conducted quite a bit of research on. So today, what I really want to do, instead of presenting kind of a single research study, I want to give a slightly broader perspective on what is really kind of a nascent field, and that is using social media in behavioral interventions. So back in November, Dr. May Stepp was here. She gave an excellent presentation, and the topic of that presentation was really looking at how people are communicating in social media about little cigar use, right? And in this presentation, I want to take it maybe like a step further and start to think about how we can use social media to actually change people's behavior and encourage the types of conversations and the types of behavioral modeling and other activities that might promote positive health behaviors, mainly in the area of physical activity and nutrition. So specifically, I really want to start today by defining and talking a little bit about what a user-generated intervention is and why you would want to have one. I'm going to talk a little bit about social media, some of the characteristics of social media that lead us to believe that it might be good for this kind of intervention approach, and the number and types of people that are using social media. Then I'm going to present some select research studies that have used social media as examples and to draw some contrast about some of the different design issues and design decisions that have to go into this kind of intervention. I'm also going to discuss some of the limitations that we've encountered so far in the research and some of the things that we anticipate in the future. And then really just to talk about some of the major issues that are going to come up as we progress in this field of research. So, what is a user-generated intervention? And why would you want to have one? So the way that I've defined this is, thinking about this is, major parts of the intervention itself are, and the content of the intervention are developed and, disseminated by the actual users, okay? And so why would you want to have that kind of intervention? Well, one of the limitations to behavioral intervention research that we've encountered is that people will develop research studies that demonstrate efficacy, right? But the dissemination, implementation of those studies is oftentimes lacking, okay? And there are a variety of reasons for that. In some cases, there's just a cost issue, right? So a lot of resources go into a particular behavioral intervention, and then once a research grant is over, there's no money to sustain whatever efforts have been made during the intervention. There are issues of having staff and people who are trained to deliver that kind of intervention. So if you think about something like cognitive behavioral therapy, weight loss interventions, you have to have the right people to do that. And sort of disseminating that actually on a population basis can be very expensive and difficult, right? So the idea of having users themselves actually contribute to parts of the intervention is appealing in that sense, that it may improve these dimensions of dissemination and implementation. The other potential advantage of this kind of approach is that you end up with something that I like to call auto-tailoring, right? So issues around cultural sensitivity or language or understanding your population, if the users themselves are generating the intervention content, those things are less of a concern because obviously they know the people that they're interacting with. And this is really an approach that I think could be successful in at least ameliorating some of those concerns that we have about dissemination and implementation. So this idea of user-generated interventions is certainly not like a new idea, right? So today we're going to be discussing how you could use these in a social media context. But this type of stuff has been going on in research for a long time, right? So we have these offline examples. One thing is what we call snowball sampling, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that's where participants recruit other participants, right? So that's a way of increasing recruitment and reach of an intervention that users are actually propagating the intervention, okay? Another thing that we've used is face-to-face support groups, right? So we know social support is a major determinant of a lot of different health behaviors, and getting people together and actually having them provide instrumental and emotional and those types of support to each other can be a very effective intervention strategy, right? We have this idea of popular opinion leader interventions, okay? So this has been used a lot in HIV interventions where you actually recruit people from the community who are influential people, and then you train them to go out and talk about different subjects and promote health in different areas, right? So that's a case where you're kind of using people in a social context that have a lot of reach in the community to go out and promote health. And then finally we have this idea of lay health workers, right? So these are people who might not have formal degrees or training, but they're trained to provide health care and other types of health interventions to people. So this idea of user-generated interventions is not, it's really not a new idea. The research question that I have is how can we use social media to implement these kinds of interventions? So first I want to talk about, really what is social media. So this is Webster's definition of social media. And I think the thing that really makes social media different is this idea of user-generated content, right? So we've had this evolution in the way that people use the web and the way that people use websites. And we started out with this thing which people call Web 1.0. There's some controversy about this, but we're just going to move with it. And so this is a website, an intervention website that I'm actually responsible for. And, this is not very interactive, right? This is what we call pushing information out to people. And You know, this is not a bad strategy if somebody really, really is highly motivated. They want information, they need information, they come, they get the information, and they go, right? So it's not that these types of approaches don't have value, but they're not particularly interactive or engaging for users, right? And so what we've done now is we've moved onto what we call Web 2.0 technologies, right? So this is, as everyone probably knows, Facebook, right? And this is, I think, really kind of the paragon of Web 2.0 and interactivity. And you can see that there are a lot of different things here that are sort of built in to engage users in this website, right? So you can go on and you can tell people what's on your mind. You know, in my experience, that's just a lot of people telling you what they had for breakfast. It's not particularly interesting, but there are sometimes things that people post that are very interesting to me, right? So you have those kind of things. You can join groups, okay, affinity groups. You can get connected with other people that share similar interests to you. Okay? You can post all kinds of different content. You can post videos. You can post links to other websites. And all of this content and all of this interactivity is in the context of some kind of social network, right? So that's the other piece of it. It's not just that people can use these websites to generate content. It's that the content that they're generating is socially connected to other people, right, in their online social network. So this Web 2.0 approach, in a way, lends itself to the idea of user-generated interventions. Now I want to talk a little bit about social media use and the people who use social media, okay? So everyone knows kind of the story of the explosion in the growth of use of social media. And I think that sometimes we get kind of inured to these numbers, right, because we've seen them so many times. But it's really astounding if you think about the fact that Facebook in a relatively short period of time has garnered, you know, over 1 billion users, right? And these are monthly active users. It's not just people that set accounts up on Facebook. And if you look at the data on how many hours a day people spend on Facebook, it makes you wonder how anybody ever gets anything done. So, you know, and that's just one of many, many social network programs. I don't even have YouTube up here, which has a tremendous amount of use. So this really kind of tells me two things about social media. One, from a marketing and communications perspective, has a tremendous amount of reach, right? So the potential to reach a lot of different people. The other thing is that there's something about these websites that's compelling to people to use. Right? Otherwise, you would not have this kind of viral growth in it. There's something compelling about the way that they're designed and the features that they offer that make people want to spend time with them and sign up for them to use them. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about Facebook, and I think that a lot of times people immediately think it's really, you know, it's a younger demographic, and it's true that it is a younger demographic, but you can see from this slide that almost half of people over 65 years of age are using Facebook, right? So, or social media. So it's not, it really is not confined to sort of young people or specific groups of people. A lot of different people are using it. The gender balance is pretty much even. And one of the things that I find most compelling about social media use is that we don't see some of the traditional disparities in SES and race ethnicity that we have with other types of web use, okay? So if you look at income, education, race ethnicity, you know, there aren't these kind of glaring differences in the prevalence of use, all right? Now, the one thing I just want to caution here, and I'll talk about this later, is that one of the key words here is that these are internet users, right? So it's not that there's not a disparity in internet use, that still exists, and I'll address that later. But once people are on the internet, we don't see the big differences in use that we do with some other types of websites. So the other thing about it that is compelling to me is that we know that people are already starting to use social media as a way to think about and discuss health. You can see here that people, you know, these aren't huge numbers, but if you think about the number of people that use Facebook in absolute terms, it's a large number of people who are following, for instance, their friends' personal health experiences on social media, okay? or they're getting health information from online social networking sites. And so, you know, we know that people are engaging in these kind of activities around health in social media. Now, the quality of this information, I'm not sure that anybody's really done a good examination of that. But we know there's interest. And so in terms of user-generated intervention, if we set up the right kind of systems, we may be able to encourage people to engage in these activities using social media. So now I want to talk about some select studies that cover a few different areas of user-generated interventions in social media, right? So the first thing, and this is kind of the first thing that people really started to use social media for in health promotion is kind of the idea of intervention delivery, right? So for a long time we've had web-based interventions in physical activity and diet and weight loss and other areas, okay? And so how do you actually use social media to deliver and enhance interventions? And then I'm going to talk a little about some of the unique data collection opportunities with social media that you don't find with other types of research. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the efforts that have made in terms of intervention, dissemination, and recruitment from a perspective. So the first study I'm going to talk about is a study that I conducted in 2011 and 2012. It's called the Internet Support for Healthy Associations Promoting Exercise Study. You always start with a great acronym, right? So in the course of conducting the study, I probably spent 6 months on the acronym. I spent 6 months on the study. But this was really a peer support intervention to increase social support for physical activity. The one thing I want to note is when I'm talking about these studies, a lot of these studies, and this one included, were sort of multi-component studies, right? So there wasn't just a social media piece. In the interest of time, I really can't go through all the elements of all these interventions. And I'm really going to focus on what social media was used. And so what we did for this study is we set up a Facebook group, right? So Facebook groups are what we call affinity groups. And then we enroll sort of users in these groups, okay? And one of the things I want to mention is in this particular study, we enroll people who didn't know each other a priori, right? So they came to the study and they were all put in this group, but they weren't connected socially, either digitally or offline, prior to that. And so this is really what the moderator did in the study. And all of these things are really designed to encourage the users themselves to interact with each other and provide support to each other. So one of the major really sort of design decisions and considerations for this particular study was that it was really not the role of the moderator to provide direct social support to people in the study. And the reason why that decision was made is that in terms of dissemination, if you did that, it would be more difficult to disseminate it because who's going to do all that work, right? So what we're really trying to do is create a structure within this group that would encourage people to produce organic social support for physical activity, okay? And so we did some different things. So part of the intervention was that people did self-monitoring, okay? And so we have data on how much physical activity they're participating in. And what we would do is we would post on the Facebook group, totals for different groups. These were undergraduates, right? So we're sort of playing, and I'll show you a picture of this in a minute, but we're kind of playing off sort of seniors versus juniors versus sophomores, et cetera. We would also have sort of incentives for people to participate, right? And these, in our case, we actually used economic incentives, but there's a growing body of research that you really actually don't have to give people anything of value, right? You can give them a little token, or you can give them a star or a badge, or somebody can give them a good rating, and it sort of gives them that nice warm feeling, and you don't actually have to give them money. So I think if I were to do this over again, I would probably actually have non-economic rewards, because that in itself would also be more disseminable, okay? We also posted a series of discussion questions to try to generate some discussion around topics related to physical activity. And we would also post content, and we would, in terms of articles, and we would encourage our participants to do the same, right? So this is This is a picture of the actual Facebook group. This is me when I was a little bit younger. Okay, I had a couple kids, and I've aged exponentially over the past few years. But this is what I'm talking about. We're posting these, we're posting like data actually from people's physical activity, and I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how that can be more automated and more integrated into social media. And then you can see posts from other participants in the group, sort of talking about their physical activity and exercise experiences, people commenting on articles that were posted by the moderator, and then people talking about what they actually did in terms of physical activity. So the theoretical basis behind this intervention was really that increases would be attributed to increases in social support and also behavioral modeling, right? So the idea is that people would see other people exercising, and that would encourage them to do it. So the next study that I want to talk about is, this is not mine, but I think it was a very interesting study and quite similar to the InShape study, but delivered in a different way and through a different social media platform. So this was called the Mobile Pounds Off Digitally study, or Mobile Pods, okay? And what was done in this study is that people joined Twitter. So is everybody familiar with Twitter? Right? Mm-hmm. So Twitter, when Twitter first came out, it was hard for me to kind of imagine that people would kind of want to know what people are just doing all the time. But apparently, if you're the right person, it's quite successful. So what this did was it would have people, they would join and they would establish a Twitter account, right? And then they would follow each other, right? So they have a cohort of participants, and they're all following each other. And similar to the InShape study, there's a moderator who's posting some information for participants and posting some discussion questions to try to increase interactivity between people, and also encouraging participants to share tips and recipes. Okay, so this was a way to try to sort of get people to start to interact with each other in some organic way. And this study was designed similarly in that there was not a lot of direct social support from the moderator, right? Because the idea, again, was that we're going to try to design something where you could disseminate it more easily, right? And this is my Twitter. I don't have a picture of mobile pods, unfortunately. I couldn't get a hold of one before. But I just kind of wanted you to get a sense. I'm not a person who really tweets a lot at all, actually. I mostly follow people on Twitter to learn things. Maybe one of these days I'll feel like I have something important enough to tweet about, but at this moment I haven't quite gotten there yet. But you can imagine that what this would look like in the intervention context is that, everyone in the intervention is following everyone else, right? And they're posting different things about weight loss and their experiences of weight loss, and they're essentially following each other. Okay. So another study I want to talk about, because this one, this was a much larger study. This was called the SMART study, and it was one of 7 studies funded by NHLBI to encourage weight loss among college students. Okay, and this study used Facebook, but a slightly different modality than Facebook. So what they used is what's called a Facebook fan page as opposed to a group. And I'll get to why that's important in a little bit. And what they did was they delivered a series of weight loss campaigns, okay, to participants in the study. And one of the other major differences in this study was that they did provide more direct interaction and social support between the moderator and the participants. Okay, so I think it raises one of the design sort of issues that I want to talk about, and that is what is the appropriate level of moderation for these kinds of interventions, right? So the more moderation you do, the lower the dissemination will potentially be for the intervention, but the effects might be greater. Okay. The other thing that was different about this study was that the idea behind it was that by creating a Facebook fan page, and I don't want to go into like all the technical details about this, but you're really trying to enlist social support from the individual's existing online social network, right? So in the case of InShape, we're setting up a group. people come into the group and they don't know each other beforehand. In this case, the idea is that in this fan page, when people post to it, their other friends on Facebook are going to see that, and they're going to potentially comment and interact with it, right? So it's leveraging the existing social network that people actually have on social media. So it's a big difference, right? And the jury is kind of still out on what the difference is, whether or not you want to have people that don't know each other beforehand, or you want to have people that do know each other. So in the InShape study, we did secondary data analysis because we had actually asked our participants to also post to their own Facebook about their experiences in the program. Okay, so that was actually part of our intervention. And we went through and we collected all of their Facebook posts, for 3 months, right? Which is a lot more fun than it sounds like. And anything that was related to physical activity, we collected those data. And we did an associational analysis where we looked at, engagement in the intervention between the group and the person's own use of Facebook, okay? And what we found were some differences in the types of support that were transmitted in those two different kinds of networks, which is not totally surprising because, in social network theory, for instance, you might think that weaker ties or weaker relationships, but a lot of them would be good, for instance, for like informational support, right? But if you really want to get more intimate emotional support from people, you probably need to know them in some way. Now, what it means to know somebody in social media, I think, is a question that we're still trying to work out. But there are definitely some differences in the approach that you can use, and I think those differences are probably going to affect how interventions work and how successful they are. So this is what SMART looked like. The study was conducted at UCSD, and you can see, you guys probably can't read this, but these are the different campaigns that they had. They had one called Gobble Less, which was like around Thanksgiving, right? So the idea that you don't go and gorge yourself and then pass out and wake up and gorge yourself and pass out. So they're posting some information here at the top. It just talks about the average American consumes 4,500 calories and 229 grams of fat throughout Thanksgiving Day. And I can tell you as a dietitian, that's probably too much. And then and then they had these things called polls, which Facebook came up with, where you could kind of answer these poll questions as a group. They also did some interesting things where they would ask participants to kind of post photos of them being physically active, or to talk about things that they had done. So this person's talking about how they were at the top of Mount Woodson, and how many pedometer steps they had, right? So this is a similar concept in shape, but I think the design here is a little bit different, and it's going to be, the results are not actually out from this trial yet, and it'll be interesting to see how it may have worked differently. So the next thing I want to talk about are some of the sort of unique data collection opportunities with social media, right? So everybody's heard these stories about big data and being able to mine data. But something like Twitter or Facebook, there's a tremendous amount of valuable behavioral data that's logged continuously, right? So not only do we know what people are doing, okay, we know when they're doing it, we know who they're doing it with, right? So we have this picture of what they're talking about, who they're talking about, and how that fits into a larger social context, right? So in social network research, one of the major limitations has always been that it's hard to get complete network data, right? And we're usually collecting it in kind of a subjective way. So we give somebody a piece of paper and we say, list your top 7 most intimate people in your life, right? So one thing that's kind of interesting is, so Facebook does this too, right? So they try to figure out who you're really close to and who you're not really close to. And the way that Facebook does, and this is kind of interesting, is they do it through posting photographs, right? So their idea is that if you are in a photograph with somebody and you tag them in that photograph, or you sort of name them or identify them, that means you're probably closer to them than if you didn't do that, right? So Facebook has algorithms that they use to determine sort of closeness in networks. And so all these data can be used to learn more about how people influence each other in social networks in real time, okay? And I think this is really, kind of the next frontier in terms of online social network research. And I'll talk about some of the challenges of that toward the end of the presentation. The other thing that I've been really quite interested in is this idea of disseminating evidence-based interventions using social media or online social networks, okay? So this is a really fascinating and interesting study that Nathan Cobb is doing at Johns Hopkins. And what they're doing in this study is they've designed this tobacco cessation application, right? So applications are sort of little pieces of software that live inside of Facebook, right? So they sort of tap into the Facebook platform and they draw data from Facebook, okay, as a part of their function, right? So what Nathan Cobb and his team have done is they've developed this tobacco cessation application. I mean, I'm not a tobacco cessation expert, but it has advice about quitting smoking, and it has the social support component and various other things. And what they're doing is they're giving this software application to seeds, right? So let's say they give it to 100 people. And then through Facebook, they can track whether or not it's shared with other people, right? And how much it's shared with other people. And the other thing that's really interesting about this study, and I think speaks to kind of the power of this kind of technology, is that they're going to see people with different versions of the application, right? And those different versions of the application will have different features that are hypothesized to increase viral dissemination, right? So user A might get the cessation application that has 2 of 3 features that we think would increase viral dissemination. User B would get 1 of 3, user C would get 3 of 3, right? And so they seed it and then they track which of these components actually work in terms of dissemination. And the goal here is for it to go what we call viral, right? So that it starts to propagate at a level where you don't have to do anything. You just put it out there and it goes, right? So this kind of approach to disseminating evidence-based or web-based interventions, I think is a really kind of interesting approach. Again, this is a really new study. The only thing that's published at this point is the protocol, so we don't know what the effect of this is going to be. We know that this kind of dissemination works really well for stuff like Farmville, right? So if you want to grow fake vegetables or virtual vegetables, I'm not sure why people do that, but they do, right? They have hundreds of millions of users for that kind of stuff. Whether or not people are going to want to do that around health topics is an open question. It's an empirical question, and hopefully, Cobb's study and other people that are working on other health behaviors will kind of get to the bottom of this. But to me, this is one of the key aspects of this type of research, is that not only are you using the features of social media to deliver and enhance components of the intervention, but you can use it to actually disseminate the intervention, which is one of the major problems we have. So if you look at web-based interventions, the world is littered with wonderful web-based interventions that like 80 people use, right? If you look at the literature, the major problem is kind of getting them out. The other advantage that Facebook has is that it's free, right? It's not really free, right? You have to look at advertising. It's an ad-supported model. But if you're an interventionist, I mean, you can build this application and you can put it on the Facebook platform, and you have to pay somebody to host it, but the cost of doing this is quite a bit lower than in a lot of other approaches. So now I just want to, I know usually these talks sort of focus a lot on results, but I kind of want to give you guys an overview of what we've learned so far. This is a very nascent field, right? So we don't have a lot of data to look at. But when you look at RCTs in this area, I mean, really few have shown changes in health behavior. So in the InShape study, we had main effects by group. Okay, so people in the intervention group increased their physical activity. But so did people in the control group, right? So we didn't have any interaction effects and we didn't see changes in social support or physical activity. And most of the other randomized control trials, when comparing two groups, have not seen a difference, okay? Unfortunately, so far, the study designs have been pretty limited because this approach has never been isolated, right? So in the InShape study, it was really a website with self-monitoring plus social media versus an educational control. So even if we had seen a difference, we wouldn't really know if the difference was attributed to what we do with social media. And the mobile pods study was very similar. They had a podcast plus the social media and a control. So it's a little too early to tell at this point, I think, whether or not the end goal of behavior change is going to be possible in these approaches. Some people have found, though, associations between this use of social media components in these interventions and some of the positive health outcomes or mediators that we'd like to see. So in InShape, in the non-Facebook group condition, we definitely saw an association between people's use and social support, right? And the same thing in mobile pods. So there's some evidence that there is an effect of these tools on either social support or behavior change. But in the randomized control trial context, we really have not sort of proved definitively whether or not this is effective. A couple things that give us some hope are that generally these formats have really high acceptability ratings, right? I think part of that is just a function of people's normal web use, right? So if you embed an intervention in something that people are already using a lot, they're more likely to use it and they're probably more familiar with it and they're probably going to like it more. And the rates of engagement in these interventions have been generally higher than other web-based interventions in physical activity and weight loss, right? So we see that people are using the interventions more, which a lot of times is a marker for their effectiveness. But again, the jury's still out in terms of randomized control trials. So now I want to talk about some of the limitations, and this is what I was alluding to before. There still is a disparity in internet access, right? So, and this is relevant because really, for the most part, you want to use high-speed internet access to use these types of tools. You can see there are some very large disparities, especially by income and education. Now, it's predictable that over time these things will start to shrink, right? As broadband penetration gets higher and cheaper, more and more people will get these. But I can tell you that I worked on a study with low-income African-American women where we used Facebook, and this is still an issue, in terms of access to the internet, and especially reliable access to the internet. So a lot of people may have access like today, but they don't have it tomorrow, or they might not have it next week, or it kind of comes and goes, right? So I think that, whenever you're talking about anything that's based on the web, you have to be sensitive to this issue of disparities, and there may be some ways to mitigate this by providing people with technology or subsidizing use of technology, but it's always something you kind of keep in the back of your mind. I think one of the things that's gonna shape this in the future is social media use by mobile. Okay, so these are data from Pew from 2012. I guarantee you these numbers are probably considerably higher this year, okay? I think about half of Facebook use is on mobile. So a lot of people are starting to use smartphones to use these social media services. And I think that smartphone penetration will kind of go the way of cell phone penetration, right? So cell phone penetration is almost ubiquitous now. And I think that will happen with smartphones as well. So I think some of these concerns about the digital divide, over time they'll lessen, but at this point there's still something to be concerned about. Another limitation is this idea of privacy, right? So everybody's read something in the newspaper about Facebook and privacy. Facebook's constantly in trouble about privacy, right? Part of that is because nobody really knows how privacy works in Facebook. It's complicated, there are a lot of settings, and there are a lot of things going on. But I think in the research context, there's a bigger question here, and that is, in research, generally, information is thought of as something that's to be protected, right? And so we're very sensitive about trying to protect people's information. These types of interventions are dependent upon people sharing information. That's the whole premise behind it. So there's always some tension in this kind of research between protecting subjects and having effective interventions. And I think in the area of physical activity, for instance, it's not as sensitive as it might be in other areas of research or other behaviors. But it's something that we have to make certain design decisions about. So earlier I was talking about this difference between a Facebook group and a Facebook fan page, right? So without going into too much detail, when somebody joins a fan page, the things that happen in that page are more visible to them through Facebook. There's whatever Facebook's algorithm is that displays information to people, they're more likely to see it if you put the intervention into a fan page than if you put it into a group. Especially if you put it into something like a closed group in Facebook that no one else has access to. But those fan pages can be seen by anyone, right? So if you have people on there talking about their weight loss experiences, it's difficult to say, how comfortable they're going to feel about having that information shared with just anybody who wants to come onto that page, right? And so there's this tension between wanting to have effective interventions that really share a lot of information, and at the same time protecting people's privacy and confidentiality. So that's something that I think we're going to struggle with in this research. The other thing I would bring up is this idea of big data, and I don't know if anyone saw this, but in the New York Times, I think maybe it was about a month or two ago, Facebook conducted this experiment. Anybody hear about this? So what they did was they would manipulate the valence of people's communications, right? So to some people, they would give them primarily negative things, or negative stories, or negative comments, and other people, they would give them primarily positive comments, right? I guess they probably mind the words, and they have a way of figuring out whether they're positive or negative. And then they would monitor what happened to that person's comments. Like, would they become more negative or more positive, right? And they didn't consent anyone into the study. They did it, right? And they got in a lot of trouble for it. So I think that this idea of big data and collecting all this network data and all this behavioral data, it's a kind of a gold mine for researchers, right? And it makes you salivate a little bit. You're like, wow, it's going to be really fantastic to be able to analyze big data. But, how do you deal with consenting 1 million people, right? You really can't do that. So we have to find some ways, maybe some new and novel ways to think about how we're going to protect subjects in that context. So another thing that's a huge limitation that should be obvious at this point is just this idea of dose and fidelity of the intervention, right? So if you're relying on users to provide content and really to provide the intervention, you have little control over the dose and fidelity, right? You don't know how much people are going to interact or be engaged, and you don't know exactly what they're going to post. You don't have control of that. So what if they're posting misinformation, right? Or what if you have a social support intervention and people start to post negative support, right? So this is something that I think is really at the heart of letting people have their own interventions, and I think for people in like community-based participatory research, this is probably a little more palatable because you have less experimental control. But this takes it a little bit further because you're really not at this point totally in control of how well your intervention is delivered or what's going to be posted. And in our studies, we've taken some steps to kind of deal with this, right? So we monitor what people post. And in the event that somebody posted something really insane or mean or whatever, we take it down, and we have protocols for that, and people agree to, be removed from the study. But if you disseminated this to 1 million people, it's really difficult to do that. Now, there are some approaches to that some organizations have used. So if you go on to, the New York Times and you look in the comments section, you can flag comments, right, if you think they're inappropriate, and then somebody at New York Times looks at them and decides whether or not to remove them. So there are sort of crowdsourced ways of dealing with misinformation or harmful information, okay? But I think it's something that is really going to have to be thought through carefully. Now I want to talk about some of the things that I think are coming up. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, and this kind of makes me chuckle, because yesterday I taught my class for the first time this semester, and half of my students had these Fitbits. Right? And I was in Dick's Sporting Goods or something over the holiday, and I mean, these things are hot, right? And everybody wants them. So if you don't know what this is a little thing you wear on your wrist. Has an accelerometer in it, it measures your steps and various other information about you. Apparently it can tell whether or not you're sleeping. I'm not really sure how it does that. But what I think is interesting about these kinds of devices, these wearable devices in terms of social media, is that now you're getting objective, real-time behavioral data. And these data, because they're digital, could be automatically integrated into interventions, right? So let's say that we think that behavioral modeling is one of the cornerstones of our intervention. We have all of our users wear this thing, and their activity is automatically uploaded into the network, and everyone else can see how much physical activity, for instance, they're getting. Or if it were a sleep intervention, maybe they could see how much you're sleeping. I don't know. I'm not sure how it would work. So this idea of having wearable technology that generates data and then can be combined with social networks, I think is a really interesting potential area of research. The second thing that I think is really interesting and a little creepy are location-based services. So location-based services, so all of you, if you have a smartphone, it probably has GPS in it. And the phone company knows where you are, right? It's great if you have an emergency. There are things like Facebook Places, right, where you can go and you can check in, and you can say, I would say, I'm at the PRC, going to talk today. And so this idea that you know where people are in space opens up a lot of interesting intervention possibilities. So let's say that somebody is near their gym, right? You could send them a message through social media that says, you haven't been to the gym in a little while, you're close to your gym. Maybe you should, you're close to Dick's Sporting, but maybe you should pick up a Fitbit. So that's, there are a lot of different, I think, opportunities with those technologies in combination with social media. Because all these data kind of feed into the network, and then everyone else can see it, right? And so maybe one of your friends sees that you're at the gym, and they're like, oh, you know what, maybe I'll go and join you there. So I think there are some interesting approaches that we can have with a combination of these technologies. Again, privacy and those things are always going to be an issue with this, and so we have to think through that. But nonetheless, interesting opportunity. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the idea of partnering with industry. Okay. Although that social science experiment that I mentioned earlier, that raised the ire of a lot of people. This particular study I always thought was really interesting. This guy, Jim Fowler, who's at UCSD, and Cameron Marlowe. So they're both researchers, right? So Jim has an appointment at UCSD, but he also works for Facebook, right? So he has, I don't know, he has like some quasi part-time position there, And so they have access to Facebook data, right? So if you call up Facebook and you say, I'd like the access to your data, they'll say no. Right? They don't just give their data out. I know at one point, there were some conversations between NIH and Facebook about trying to create some way to let researchers use it. But the way they've gotten around that is they hire people, right? So this was a study where they, on election day, if you voted, you would sort of indicate on Facebook that you voted, right? And then they would send a message to your friends that you voted and did you vote. So it's sort of this way of increasing voting. And it was a randomized control trial, so some people would get X message, some people would get Y message, and some people would get no message. And then they measured how much people actually voted, right? Because it's not an objective measure because they're not going to the polls with you, but they know whether or not you indicated that you voted, right? So this is a really interesting study with 61 million people. But the point that it raises is that having a partnership with industry, I think, would be really valuable for two reasons. One, just the access to the data would be great to have. So in my study, we had to manually collect all this data, right? And there's a lot of data that we miss. Like we don't, for instance, we have no idea if people are looking at stuff on Facebook, but not commenting on it or liking it, right? There's a lot of lurking behavior in online social networks. So maybe 40% of the behavior is called lurking, right? So people are just looking at stuff, right? So that has an effect on people, but we really can't measure it, right? Facebook can measure that because they know if you went to the page, right? They know how long you stayed on. And the other thing is I think that these companies are generally ahead of us, right? In terms of experimenting with how to increase user engagement, right? So this idea of dose and fidelity that I talked about before, that could be the death knell of this approach. If you can't engage users in these interventions, then they don't work, right? And so we know that, companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter, they are constantly running tiny little randomized control trials where they make very small changes to the interface. And they're figuring out what engages people, right? So just having that kind of institutional knowledge could help our approaches as well. Okay. The other thing I want to mention is just this idea of funding and research models, right? So I'm not going to take credit for this, but Bill Riley, who's at NIH, has this great slide, right, where he shows kind of the history of technology, right? And so the typical sort of R01 cycle from the conception of the study to the finish of it, it could be 5 or 6 years, right? So in 5 or 6 years, technology has changed so much that this idea of studying technology in that way is really antiquated and quite difficult, right? So if you started, let's say you started a study 7 years ago, and you were testing something, or let's say 10 years ago, you decided you wanted to study MySpace, right? Go on. So this idea of having this sort of long, methodical funding cycle, it doesn't necessarily work for technology research. And the research designs themselves, I think, may have to change in order for us to be more effective. This idea of conducting like large, long-term randomized control trials may not be the best approach. So there are some other types of study designs. I recommend you look at this Riley paper if you're interested in this topic, because we have these data, and because we're delivering an intervention in this platform, we can change it quickly, right? We don't have to design a big intervention, roll it out, let it run its course. We can see in a short period of time if something's working or not working, and we can change it, right? And so some of these other designs might be better suited to doing that type of research. And of course, we would like for funders to be more receptive to that. So I don't know if there are any funders here, but if you are, you're on the study section, and you should put it up. So these are the references, and we're going to post the slides, right? So you can get these. And I just wanted to thank you all for coming. So, and I think we're going to have a Q&A if we have time.
Yeah, we definitely. I guess we can open it up to comments, questions, reactions.
Yeah. The question is, in all of these studies, even though it is focused on the younger population, Facebook seemed to be the obvious choice. So I wanted to know why, essentially, because there are other options like Reddit, where you have subreddits, and especially it's being found quite useful for suicide prevention among young adult males. So I wanted to know why.
Yeah, so I mean, part of it is just a lag, right? So most of these studies were probably conducted in 2011, 2012, the ones that have made it to publication. I mean, I actually was on the phone with someone the other day, and they were like, "Oh, Facebook's over."
Right.
A lot of people say that. They still have billions of users, so I'm not as concerned about it. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I'm sure there are people out there right now that are doing studies with other. Instagram's a perfect example. I mean, I think that would be a really interesting platform. I just think there's a lag in publication, and so I have the opportunity to review studies. So I've seen a couple papers. I can't really talk about them, but they've used other social media platforms. So your question though I think raises a bigger point, and that is the idea here is not to study Facebook. I mean, I think that's a fool's errand, right? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen to Facebook. It probably will be around, but it might not. To me, the idea is to study principles around, social networking technology, and to design studies that can answer sort of fundamental questions about whether certain features and other things work that are used by all these different platforms, because they're going to kind of come and go. I mean, over time, users are probably going to jump from one to the other. But to me, it's more a question of trying to answer questions about principles.
Thanks, this was really great. I think the concept of time and changes also goes in the other direction, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how changes in the platform might damage interventions, or you sort of have to be ready to react to platform changes. Like, I believe there's no such thing as a Facebook group anymore.
Yeah. So, no, that's a great question. So I'll tell you a story about a friend of mine who conducts this kind of research. So she designed this intervention, and like a week before the intervention, I mean, Facebook totally changed their entire system around groups, and because it's been through multiple iterations. There were groups and pages, and then groups changed, and then it's so her whole thing just kind of got blown up like a week before it's supposed to start. So I would say a couple things about that. One, and this is a design decision that I've struggled with over time, is do you use something like Facebook or do you use something like Ning and develop your own network, right? And I think the downside to Facebook is, one, less opportunity for data collection, right? And also exactly what you mentioned. Facebook, they don't call me when they're going to change. I've asked them. They don't contact me when they're going to change their algorithm or the way that the thing functions, and they do it a lot. I mean, it's not all that uncommon for them to change it. So those are the downsides. The upside is that people like to use it. And, this is amazing to me, but we did some interviews and focus groups with undergraduate females for this in-shape study when we were designing it. And they said, that extra click is like beyond them. I mean, like, one extra click is too much. I mean, they're in Facebook. They do not want to have to go to another website or another social network. So I think there's a trade-off there between user familiarity, and also if you're going to harness their existing social network, the only way you can really do that is through an existing platform. But it's a great question, and it's really difficult. You kind of just, it's kind of like, I would say it's like CDPR in a lot of ways. I mean, you can be in a community conducting a study, and in some secular thing can happen, and it can kind of really make you have to think on the fly and change. And it also speaks to this idea of different kinds of designs. So you're not locked, you don't lock yourself into this one intervention. If you have the ability to iterate, I think that could also alleviate that problem. Anyone else?
I actually have another question.
Yeah, sure.
So in the latter part of your presentation, you did mention about wearables and Fitbit in particular. So do you think that also gives you, unlike Facebook, which is like an open social networking technology, or new technology, you could probably use these wearables for mining data, because you already have these participants who are, engaged enough to share data, so you don't need to worry about opt-in and all these things. They're willingly sharing their activities. So what are your thoughts on that collection of data, fidelity, or?
Yeah, I mean, the validity of those things, I can't really speak to that. I know people study that, like, are they accurate or not? I think, you know, you always introduce some bias there. If, for instance, you're recruiting people that already have them, if you provide them to them, you know, I don't think people are that uptight about sharing data, actually. In my experience, you know, when I first started this, I really had concerns that, like, people weren't gonna wanna share, but they can't help it. They love to. I mean, they want to tell you everything about themselves all the time. It's partly a generational thing. So I think that, you know, I think all of these technologies, you know, they have different pros and cons in terms of how you collect the data. But what I like about them is the idea that you collect it automatically, and that's what I like about something like Fitbit. It doesn't require, if it requires a user to do something, you're halfway dead already, right? So the easier you can make it for them to provide the data, the better. So in our study, we have people self-monitoring on the web, but we know a lot of people don't really adhere to that particularly well. But if they're wearing something, I think it would be way more effective.
You also have the location as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you're getting, you're getting a lot of rich data from those devices. So.
But what would be the, especially the fidelity part of it, or well, you know, the ethics part of it? Would it be something to consider, or?
Well, I think, you know, so it depends on the situation. In a case where you're not consenting people and you're just collecting their data, you know, that's a whole different thing. Like, but if you're conducting a study where people are consenting to have their data collected and they know what you're going to do with it, and they know how it's going to be displayed, I mean, that's important. So, you know, we make it clear to participants in our studies, you know, if it's a Facebook fan page, you know what? Anybody can come and look at this. Now, the chances of them finding this fan page and actually looking at it are fairly low, but, you know, I think you have to make sure that participants are completely informed about what the risks are of exposure of their data and what you're going to collect and what you're going to do with it, just like any other research stuff. The idea of mining data from large numbers of people without their consent, I mean, I don't really have an answer to that question. I think that's a newer area in research that we're going to have to find. There might have to be some independent body of people that determine, you know, whether or not what the risk is overall. You know, the other issue is figuring out who people are, right, from data. So, you know, people have done modeling studies where they've looked at, like, how many points of data do you have to have about a person before you can identify them. It's a pretty small number, actually. So, you know, whenever you fill out your RB application, they always ask you that question, you know, what's the chance that somebody can deductively figure out who your participants are. In large data sets, there's a pretty high risk of that, actually. So I think that those are issues that probably people that are smarter than me are going to have to figure out, but I think it might just have to be some independent group of people that determine what the level of risk is for that kind of research, and they either give the person the permission to do it without consent or not. I think that's where we're probably going to go, because you can't consent 60 million people. You know, Facebook probably has, I mean, you guys see those, like, terms of use, right? They're like 80 pages long. Anybody ever read one of those? Probably, like, you know, they may have something. I've never read through Facebook. They may have something in there about we can manipulate you, the valence of your, you know, I don't know. So there could be some kind of consent that's kind of baked into those things, but I'm not sure about that or not. Yeah.
You know, what's your, have you found that it's primarily reliable internet access that is a barrier for people in lower SES, or are there other issues for them in terms of, you know, social media interventions?
Yeah, I think it's hard to recruit low SES and keep low SES people in innovations, period. I don't think it's a unique challenge to social media innovation. You know, I think it has to do with resources and, you know, sometimes people are more transient and they just have other things in their lives that keep us. So I don't think it's necessarily a social media issue, but I think internet access is still an issue in some groups. We've done a little bit of like formative and survey data collection around that. But our experience in conducting intervention with those groups is that there are issues with internet access, but the other sort of social issues are probably actually have a much larger effect. And anyone who's conducted research in lower SES groups, I think, has probably experienced some difficulty in attrition and engagement. I think that's just the nature of that type of research. I mean, hopefully there may be, my hope is that it's easier though than there may be an advantage to it over face-to-face, for instance. That's the hope, even though it's not perfect, that it does lower some burdens for people who don't have reliable transportation or resources, or even sort of rural-based interventions. That there may be it may make things better, but those problems, I think, they cut across all those kinds of interventions. Well, thank you very much.
And just to keep in mind for next month, Erica Trappel and colleagues